Hey viewers! Before we dive into one of the most incredible stories from World War I, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our historical deep dives. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Whether you're tuning in from the United States, Europe, or anywhere else in the world, I want to hear from you. Your support and engagement mean everything to this channel. Now, let's get into this amazing story. Imagine charging across an open wheat field, your boots pounding the earth as machine gun bullets slice through the air like angry hornets. All around you, men are falling, screaming, dying in the golden grain. The German defenders are laughing, confident that no force on earth could cross that killing field and survive. They've done this before. They've massacred British, French, and now American forces with the same methodical efficiency. Their machine gun positions are perfectly interlocked, their fields of fire calculated with Prussian precision. But then, something impossible happens. A small group of Marines, we don't even know their names, stumbles. This is the story of how desperation, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness created one of World War II's most lethal tank killers. The Sherman Firefly wasn't supposed to exist. It was a stopgap measure, a compromise, a desperate attempt to solve a problem that was getting Allied tank crews killed at an alarming rate. By 1943, the balance of armored warfare had shifted dramatically. Germany's Tiger and Panther tanks were rolling onto battlefields across Europe with armor so thick that standard Allied guns simply bounced off. British tank crews were being slaughtered. American crews would soon face the same fate in Normandy. The 75mm guns mounted on regular Shermans could barely scratch the frontal armor of these German beasts at combat ranges. The human cost was staggering. Tank crews knew that engaging a Tiger or Panther meant almost certain death unless they could get close enough for a side shot, and getting that close usually meant you were already burning. British and Commonwealth forces would face over 70% of all German armor deployed during the Battle of Normandy, including the most elite Waffen-SS panzer units. They needed a solution, and they needed it before the invasion of France. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun existed. It could kill Tigers and Panthers. But mounting it in a tank? That was a different story entirely. This is about the men who made it happen anyway, and why their rejected design became the most valued tank in the British arsenal, and the most feared by German tank commanders. To understand why the Sherman Firefly mattered, you need to understand the crisis facing Allied armor in 1943. When World War II began, British tank doctrine revolved around the 40mm 2-pounder gun. It worked fine against early German panzers. But by 1941, in the deserts of North Africa, British crews were facing German tanks with 50mm of monolithic frontal armor that could only be penetrated at point-blank range, if at all. The Germans weren't standing still. They were innovating, upgrading, building bigger and more lethal machines. Then came the Tiger I. Deployed in late 1942, the Tiger I was a monster. It weighed 54 tons, carried armor up to 100mm thick on the front, and mounted the legendary 88mm gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, now adapted to blow Allied tanks apart at ranges exceeding a mile. The Tiger's 88mm could penetrate Allied armor before Allied guns could even reach it. British crews called engaging a Tiger suicide, unless you had overwhelming numbers, air support, or got incredibly lucky with a side or rear shot. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was in many ways even worse. Faster than the Tiger, more maneuverable, with sloped armor that was exceptionally effective. It mounted a 75mm gun with superior velocity and range compared to Allied weapons. And unlike the Tiger, which Germany produced in limited numbers, only about 1,300 ever reached the battlefield, the Panther would become common. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Panthers and Tigers would account for a significant portion of the German armored force, and Allied tank crews were woefully unprepared. Meanwhile, the backbone of Allied armor was the M4 Sherman, an American-designed medium tank that was never intended to fight other tanks. That's right. The Sherman's primary design purpose was infantry support. It was meant to support advancing troops, destroy fortifications, and handle anti-tank guns. Tank versus tank combat was supposed to be handled by specialized tank destroyers, not medium tanks. The Sherman had many virtues. It was reliable. It was easy to maintain. It could be mass-produced. American factories would eventually build nearly 50,000 of them. It was mechanically superior to German tanks in many ways, with better ergonomics, better crew survivability after being hit, and far superior logistics and supply chains. But when it came to firepower against heavy armor, the Sherman standard 75mm gun was inadequate. At typical combat ranges, it simply could not penetrate the frontal armor of Tigers or Panthers. And the Sherman's armor, while adequate against most threats, offered little protection against the 88mm or the Panther's 75mm at range. American and British tank crews knew that engaging German heavy armor meant you needed numbers, flanking maneuvers, and often accepting casualties. The British recognized this problem early. They'd been fighting in North Africa. They'd seen what Tigers could do. And they had a solution: the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. Developed in 1942 and first used in combat in February 1943 in Tunisia, the 17-pounder was a revelation. With a 76.2mm caliber and a muzzle velocity of up to 3,950 feet per second with armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, it could defeat armor 120 to 208mm thick at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 meters. It could kill Tigers and Panthers from the front. British gunners loved it. But there was a problem. The 17-pounder was massive. It was heavy. It had a 40-inch recoil travel. And no British tank could mount it effectively. The Challenger tank, specifically designed to carry the 17-pounder, was running into delays and problems. The Cromwell tank's turret ring was too small. Britain needed a 17-pounder armed tank for the coming invasion of France, and they didn't have one. That's where two determined officers enter the story. By early 1943, the crisis was undeniable. British armor doctrine called for 30% of their tank fleet to mount 17-pounder guns, 60% to carry standard 75mm guns, and 10% to mount 95mm howitzers for close support. But there were precious few platforms capable of mounting the 17-pounder, and none of them were working out. The A-30 Challenger, based on the Cromwell hull, seemed promising at first. It was specifically designed to mount the 17-pounder. But trials at the Lulworth Armored Fighting School revealed serious problems. The tank was heavy, clumsy, and unsuitable for modern mobile warfare. Production was slow. By fall 1943, it became clear the Challenger wouldn't be ready in sufficient numbers for the planned invasion of Normandy, scheduled for June 1944. The clock was ticking. Major George Brighty, stationed at Lulworth in early 1943, had watched the Challenger trials and joined the chorus of complaints about the vehicle. He was a tanker himself, Royal Tank Regiment, and he understood what crews needed. He'd also been paying attention to another tank arriving in British service, the American M4 Sherman. The British were receiving thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease. British crews liked them. They were reliable, comfortable, well-designed. But everyone knew they'd be inadequate against the next generation of German tanks. The Sherman's 75mm gun was fine for infantry support and could handle Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz 3s. But against Tigers and Panthers? It was nearly useless at combat ranges. Brighty had an idea. What if you could mount the 17-pounder in a Sherman turret? You'd combine American reliability and mass production with British firepower. But there was a massive problem. The Sherman's turret was never designed for a gun that size. The 17-pounder traveled 40 inches backward during recoil, far too long for the Sherman's turret geometry. The gun's breech was enormous and would take up most of the turret space. Where would the radio go? How would the loader operate? The gun barrel would protrude so far forward it would be difficult to transport and could hit the ground on rough terrain. And remember, this wasn't a new tank design. This was trying to shoehorn a gun designed for one purpose into a turret designed for a completely different weapon. Every military engineer who looked at it said the same thing: impossible. The Ministry of Supply's Tank Decision Board officially rejected the concept. They pointed out that Britain was already developing the Challenger to mount the 17-pounder, and the Cromwell would provide the backbone of British armor with its expected Vickers high-velocity 75mm gun. Plus, more advanced British tanks were on the drawing board: the Comet and eventually the Centurion. Why waste resources trying to modify an American tank when British tanks were in development? It was a reasonable argument. Resources were stretched thin. Britain was fighting a total war. Every pound spent, every engineer assigned to a project, every hour of manufacturing capacity, it all had to count. Dividing resources to mount a gun on a foreign-built tank seemed wasteful. But Brighty wouldn't let it go. And fortunately, he found an ally. Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge had been badly wounded in North Africa when his M3 Grant was knocked out at Gazala. After recovering, he'd been posted to Fort Knox in the United States for 6 months in January 1943 to advise on gunnery. While there, he became, in his own words, sold on the Sherman. He saw its potential. When he returned to Britain and connected with Brighty at Lulworth, the two men decided to pursue the 17-pounder Sherman conversion on their own initiative. They started experimenting. The first attempt was crude. They mounted the gun rigidly with no recoil system, testing it on a rail mount with the recoil energy absorbed directly into the turret face. It worked, technically, but it was far from ideal. Fixed-mount guns take an enormous toll on the vehicle structure. Every shot would damage the tank itself. It wasn't a solution, it was barely a proof of concept. Then came the order from the Department of Tank Design: cease your efforts immediately. The Ministry of Supply was in turmoil over what guns should go in which tanks. Resources couldn't be wasted on unauthorized projects. The official word came down: stop working on the Sherman 17-pounder. The Americans had even weighed in, stating that such a notion was unrealistic and impossible to achieve. Brighty and Witheridge had a choice: follow orders and abandon the project, or find a way to make it official. Witheridge had connections. He knew influential people, including Major General Raymond Briggs, the former commanding officer of the 1st Armored Division in North Africa and currently director of the Royal Armored Corps. Witheridge used those connections. He lobbied. He explained the concept. He emphasized the desperate need for a 17-pounder armed tank before the invasion of France. Eventually, he convinced Claude Gibb, the Director General of Weapons and Instruments Production at the Ministry of Supply, to make it an official ministry project. The amateur efforts at Lulworth would be handed over to professional tank developers. The project had a lifeline. But could it actually be done? Enter W.G.K. Kilbourne, a Vickers engineer working for the Department of Tank Design. If anyone could solve the seemingly impossible problem of fitting a 17-pounder into a Sherman turret, it was Kilbourne. He'd been working on various tank projects throughout the war and understood the mechanical challenges involved. When the Ministry of Supply contacted him, Kilbourne was told they didn't think the 17-pounder would ever fit the Sherman turret. The Americans had declared it unrealistic. Everyone said it couldn't be done. But Kilbourne sat down with the plans and blueprints, spent one night working through the problems, and called back the next morning with a simple message: it could be done. But he would need a dedicated team and official support. He got both. Kilbourne's first challenge was the recoil. The standard 17-pounder recoil system allowed the gun to travel 40 inches backward when fired, far too much for the confined space of the Sherman's turret. Simply using the existing gun design wouldn't work. Kilbourne needed to completely redesign the recoil system from scratch. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of a single large recoil system, he designed shorter recoil recuperators positioned on both sides of the gun. This took advantage of the turret's width rather than its depth. The stacked recoil cylinders could absorb the massive force of the 17-pounder while keeping the gun stable within the Sherman's turret geometry. The gun breech itself was also rotated 90 degrees to allow loading from the left side rather than from the top, a crucial change that made the gun operable within the tight confines of the turret. But repositioning the recoil system and breech created new problems. The radio, normally mounted in the back of British tanks' turrets, now had nowhere to go. Kilbourne's solution? Add an armored box, called a bustle, welded to the rear of the turret. This bustle would house the radio equipment and simultaneously serve as a counterweight for the massive gun barrel extending forward. Access to the radio was through a large hole cut through the turret rear. It was inelegant, but it worked. The gun cradle, the metal block on which the gun sat, had to be shortened to allow the gun to fit into the turret. But a shortened cradle meant the gun wasn't stable. Kilbourne designed a new barrel for the 17-pounder with a longer untapered section at the base, which helped solve the stability problem. A new mantlet was designed to house the modified gun and cradle. Every component had to be precisely engineered to work within the Sherman's existing structure. Then there was the ammunition problem. The 17-pounder's rounds were significantly longer than the 75mm ammunition the Sherman was designed to carry. More storage space was needed. Kilbourne's solution was radical: eliminate the hull gunner position entirely. The co-driver's seat was removed, the bow machine gun was taken out and the aperture plated over, and the entire area was converted into ammunition storage. The Firefly would have a 4-man crew instead of the Sherman Standard 5, but it could now carry 78 rounds of 17-pounder ammunition. The loader's position had to be completely reworked. The massive breech of the 17-pounder blocked the loader's exit through the commander's rotating roof hatch, the standard escape route for Sherman turret crews. If the tank was hit and caught fire, the loader would be trapped. This was unacceptable. Kilbourne ordered a new hatch cut into the top of the turret, positioned directly over the loader's station. It was an additional weak point in the armor, but it potentially saved the loader's life if the tank had to be evacuated quickly. By October and November 1943, enthusiasm began to grow for the project. The modifications were extensive. In fact, so extensive that 17-pounders intended for the Firefly had to be factory-built specifically for that role. They were designated as the Mark IV variant of the 17-pounder and couldn't be used for standard anti-tank gun duties. But the testing showed it worked. The impossible had become possible. The timing couldn't have been better. By late 1943, the delays with the Challenger program became critical. It was increasingly clear that the tank wouldn't be ready in time or in sufficient numbers for the Normandy invasion. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was beginning to realize through statistical analysis that the Germans were fielding far more formidable tanks than initially expected. The Panther, which Allied planners thought would be rare like the Tiger, was actually going into mass production. In early 1944, before the full extent of the Challenger's problems became apparent, Winston Churchill himself gave the Firefly program highest priority in preparation for D-Day. Production began. The first tanks were converted in early 1944, just in time to equip the 21st Army Group commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for the Normandy landings. The conversion process was intensive. Tanks were tested to ensure they were suitable. The British were afraid of overloading the turrets and put them through rigorous trials. Blueprints were finalized by December 3, 1943, though the ammunition rack designs took until the end of the month to complete. Most Fireflies were converted from the Sherman V, the American M4A4, mainly because Britain had received large Lend-Lease deliveries of that model, though Sherman IS, M4S, were also converted. Between 2,100 and 2,200 Fireflies were manufactured before production ended in 1945. It wasn't a massive number. Germany had produced over 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. But it was enough. British doctrine called for distributing Fireflies throughout Sherman squadrons, typically one Firefly for every 3 or 4 standard Shermans. This provided each platoon and troop with at least one tank capable of engaging German heavy armor. The Firefly wasn't without drawbacks. The turret was cramped, extremely cramped. Ken Tout, a tank gunner and commander in the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, described working in a Firefly. The Firefly tank is an ordinary Sherman, but, in order to accommodate the immense breech of the 17-pounder and to store its massive shells, the co-driver has been eliminated and his little den has been used as storage space. The flash is so brilliant that both gunner and commander need to blink at the moment of firing. Otherwise they will be blinded for so long that they will not see the shot hit the target. The muzzle flash spurts out so much flame that, after a shot or two, the hedge or undergrowth in front of the tank is likely to start burning. The powerful blast from the 17-pounder kicked up enormous amounts of dirt and smoke, making it difficult for the gunner to observe where the shot landed. The commander had to spot the fall of shot and order corrections. The muzzle blast could cause temporary night blindness in crew members. And the long barrel, extending far beyond a standard Sherman's gun, made the Firefly immediately identifiable to German crews. But none of that mattered when the gun fired, because when it did, it could kill anything on the battlefield. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Sherman Fireflies rolled onto the beaches of Normandy as part of the largest amphibious invasion in history. Allied intelligence had been incomplete. They'd expected some Panthers, perhaps a few Tigers. What they got was a massive concentration of German armored forces, particularly in the British and Canadian sectors, where Montgomery's operations were designed to pin down German armor and prevent it from reinforcing the American breakthrough to the west. The Firefly's value became apparent almost immediately. Panthers and Tigers accounted for only about 126 of the 2,300 German tanks deployed in Normandy. The rest were Panzer IVs, Sturmgeschütz 3s, and other armored vehicles that standard 75mm Shermans could handle. But those 126 heavy tanks were concentrated precisely where British and Commonwealth forces were fighting. British units faced over 70% of all German armor deployed during the Battle of Normandy, and over half of the elite Waffen-SS Panzer units. Without the Firefly, this could have been a catastrophe. Instead, the Firefly became the most valued tank in the British arsenal. At standard combat ranges in the bocage country of Normandy, typically between 500 and 1,500 meters, the Firefly could penetrate the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. No other British or American tank could reliably do this. Standard Shermans with 75mm guns were helpless at range. Even the American 76mm gun, when it finally arrived later in the campaign, was inferior to the 17-pounder in armor penetration and couldn't reliably defeat Panthers from the front. The Germans noticed. They noticed quickly. German tank and anti-tank gun crews received explicit orders: engage Fireflies first. Always target the Firefly before any other tank. The long barrel made them easy to identify, and German crews knew that as long as a Firefly was operational, they were in mortal danger. A Panther or Tiger could shrug off hits from regular Shermans all day. A single hit from a Firefly could end them. British and Canadian crews responded with camouflage. They painted disruptive patterns on the forward half of the gun barrel, trying to make it appear shorter from a distance. They draped camouflage netting over the turret and barrel. They did everything they could to make their Fireflies look like regular Shermans until it was too late for the Germans to react. The combat records speak for themselves. One of the most famous Firefly actions occurred near the village of Normandy in June 1944. 9 Sherman tanks from the Elgin Regiment, including several Fireflies, were moving toward the front when they spotted advancing German Panthers from the 3rd Panzer Company. The Panthers had just turned left to avoid British 6-pounder anti-tank guns in the village, and this exposed their flanks to the Canadian Shermans at approximately 1,000 meters distance. The Shermans deployed in a line and opened fire. A Firefly commanded by Lieutenant Henry, with Trooper A. Chapman as gunner, engaged first. Chapman later described how he waited until the Panthers lined up like ducks in a row. In rapid succession, Chapman's Firefly knocked out 5 Panthers with just 6 rounds. The entire German attack was repulsed with the loss of 7 of the 12 Panthers. Perhaps the most significant Firefly action involved SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of Germany's most famous tank aces with 138 confirmed tank kills. On August 8, 1944, during Operation Totalize, Wittmann's Tiger, numbered 007, was destroyed. While the exact circumstances remain debated, multiple sources indicate it was most likely a Sherman Firefly from a squadron of the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment that destroyed Wittmann's Tiger. The psychological impact was enormous. If even Wittmann couldn't survive against Fireflies, what chance did ordinary German crews have? Another remarkable action involved Trooper Joe Ekins, gunner in Sergeant Gordon's Firefly named Velikai Luki. A squadron's tanks were named after Soviet cities. On August 8, 1944, from positions overlooking Route Nationale 158 near Sinthos, Ekins observed German Tigers advancing. He waited until they were in range, then engaged. In a 12-minute exchange of fire, Ekins destroyed all 3 Tigers that his troop could see. A short time later, during the main German counterattack, Ekins destroyed a Panzer IV before his own tank was hit and the crew had to bail out. 3 Tigers and a Panzer IV destroyed by 1 Firefly crew in a single engagement. The statistics reveal the Firefly's impact. Despite being high-priority targets, German crews were specifically ordered to kill them first. Fireflies statistically had a lower chance of being knocked out than standard Shermans. This was probably due more to how they were employed, carefully positioned, frequently moved after firing, supported by other tanks, than to the effectiveness of barrel camouflage. But it demonstrates that in the hands of trained crews using proper tactics, the Firefly not only survived but dominated. By late 1944, the Americans realized what they'd missed. The British had offered in August 1943 to manufacture 200 Fireflies monthly for American service, including ammunition supply. The Americans declined at the time, satisfied with their planned 76mm gun development. But after experiencing the Panthers and Tigers in Normandy and watching British Fireflies perform, the U.S. Army requested Fireflies in late 1944. By then it was too late. British production was fully committed to equipping their own forces. Some conversions destined for the U.S. Army were performed in 1945, but they never saw combat. The Firefly also served with distinction in the Italian campaign, where British, Commonwealth, and Polish units used them against German armor throughout 1944 and into 1945. Everywhere they deployed, they proved invaluable. The psychological effect on German crews cannot be overstated. German tankers learned quickly that the tank with the long barrel was death. They feared it. Tank commander reports and post-war interviews consistently reference the respect and fear German crews had for the Firefly. It was one of the few Allied tanks that could go toe-to-toe with their best and win. Production continued through 1945. The Firefly equipped British, Canadian, Polish, and Free French units. It fought from Normandy through northern France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany itself. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, approximately 2,100 to 2,200 Fireflies had been built. Every single one of them was a modification that the Ministry of Supply said was impossible, that the Tank Decision Board rejected, and that the Americans dismissed as unrealistic. And every single one of them was proof that two stubborn officers who refused to accept "no" for an answer had saved countless Allied lives and changed the course of armored warfare in Europe. The Sherman Firefly's legacy extends far beyond its impressive kill record in World War II. It represents something fundamental about innovation under pressure, about persistence in the face of institutional resistance, and about what's possible when skilled engineers are given a problem they're told can't be solved. First, let's address what happened to the Firefly itself. After the war ended, Fireflies remained in British service for several years. They were eventually replaced as the British Army modernized its armored force with purpose-built designs like the Comet and later the Centurion. But Fireflies found continued life in foreign service. They were exported to various nations, and some remained operational well into the 1950s and even early 1960s in some militaries. The design principles, mounting the most powerful gun possible on a reliable, proven chassis, influenced post-war tank development around the world. The broader impact on the Sherman tank family was significant. The Firefly demonstrated that the Sherman platform was far more adaptable than anyone had initially believed. If you could mount a gun as large as the 17-pounder in a Sherman turret, what else was possible? This thinking influenced post-war Sherman modifications, particularly the extensive rebuilds conducted by Israel, which transformed standard Shermans into formidable fighting vehicles that remained competitive into the 1970s. But the real lessons of the Firefly story go deeper than hardware. Lesson 1. Institutional resistance to innovation. The Firefly almost didn't happen because established institutions rejected it. The Ministry of Supply's Tank Decision Board had perfectly logical reasons for their rejection. Britain was developing the Challenger specifically for the 17-pounder. Resources were limited. The war was stretching British industrial capacity to its limits. Why divert resources to modify an American tank when British designs were in development? On paper, it made sense. In reality, it would have been a disaster. The Challenger was delayed and ultimately unsuitable. The Cromwell's turret ring couldn't accommodate the 17-pounder. If Brighty and Witheridge had accepted the official rejection and stopped their work, British forces would have landed in Normandy without a single tank capable of reliably engaging Panthers and Tigers. The casualties would have been catastrophic. This happens in every military, in every organization, throughout history. Good ideas get killed by bureaucracy, by resource allocation decisions that seem logical in isolation, by committees that lack the broader perspective to see what's actually needed in the field. The Firefly survived because two officers refused to quit and because they found champions within the system, people like Major General Briggs and Claude Gibb, who had the authority and vision to override institutional resistance. Lesson 2. The value of engineering excellence. W.G.K. Kilbourne deserves recognition alongside Brighty and Witheridge. When told the 17-pounder couldn't fit in a Sherman turret, he didn't accept that conclusion. He spent one night analyzing the problem and identified solutions that everyone else had missed. Shortened recoil recuperators positioned laterally. Rotating the breech 90 degrees. Adding a counterweight bustle. Modifying the barrel. Eliminating the hull gunner position. Cutting new hatches. None of these solutions were obvious. Each required deep engineering knowledge, creative problem-solving, and understanding of complex mechanical systems. Kilbourne didn't just make the gun fit, He made it functional, safe, and effective. His work transformed an impossible challenge into a production weapon system that could be manufactured and deployed at scale. This is engineering at its finest, taking a problem that appears unsolvable and methodically breaking it down into solvable components. It's a lesson applicable far beyond tank design. In any field, when told something is impossible, the right question isn't, why can't it be done? But rather, what would have to change for it to be possible? Lesson 3. Doctrine versus reality. The Sherman was designed for infantry support, not tank versus tank combat. American doctrine called for specialized tank destroyers to handle enemy armor. This made sense in theory. In practice, on the battlefield, tanks fought tanks constantly. Doctrine had to adapt to reality, not the other way around. The British recognized this faster than the Americans. British armor doctrine was more flexible, perhaps because of their earlier combat experience in North Africa. They understood that any tank might encounter enemy armor and needed to be able to defend itself. The Firefly embodied this realistic approach. Give your tanks the capability to handle the worst threats they might face, even if that's not their primary mission. The American reluctance to adopt the Firefly, or to urgently upgrade their own Shermans with more powerful guns, stemmed partially from this doctrinal blindness. Senior officers believed tank destroyers would handle Panthers and Tigers. They believed the 75mm gun was adequate for the Sherman's intended role. They were wrong, and American tank crews paid the price in Normandy until better weapons became available. Lesson 4. The power of mass production and logistics. The Firefly wouldn't have mattered without the Sherman platform. The Sherman itself was a triumph of industrial engineering, designed to be mass-produced, easily maintained, and logistically sustainable. American factories produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. British factories converted over 2,000 into Fireflies. This production capacity, combined with reliable supply chains and maintenance systems, meant that when a Firefly was lost, it could be replaced. When it broke down, it could be repaired. Compare this to German armor. Tigers and Panthers were mechanically complex, difficult to produce, and nightmares to maintain. The Panther in particular was notoriously unreliable. German forces in Normandy lost as many Panthers to mechanical breakdowns as to combat. The Tiger was so resource-intensive to build that only 1,300 were ever completed. Germany couldn't replace losses. They couldn't keep their tanks running. The Firefly combined British firepower with American reliability and production capacity. It wasn't the most powerful tank on the battlefield. The Tiger II, introduced late in the war, was more heavily armed and armored. But it was there, in numbers when it mattered. That's the lesson. Operational availability multiplied by reliability often matters more than theoretical superiority. Lesson 5. Human factors in combat. The Firefly was cramped, uncomfortable, and produced blinding muzzle flash. Loading the gun was difficult. The commander had to spot fall of shot because the gunner couldn't see through the smoke and debris. It was far from perfect. But crews loved it. Because when they encountered Panthers and Tigers, when they faced the moment every Allied tanker dreaded, they had a gun that could fight back. They had a chance. The psychological impact of knowing you can hurt the enemy, that you're not helpless, cannot be overstated. Morale is a weapon system. Confidence affects combat performance. The Firefly gave British and Commonwealth tank crews confidence. Conversely, the psychological impact on German crews was devastating. They learned to fear the long-barreled Sherman. They received orders to target it first, which meant exposing themselves to other Allied tanks. The Firefly forced German tankers to change their tactics, to be more cautious, to respect Allied armor in ways they hadn't before. Lesson 6. Sometimes, good enough now beats perfect later. The Firefly was always intended as a stopgap. The British knew they'd eventually replace it with better tanks, the Comet, the Centurion. Those tanks were objectively superior designs. But they weren't ready for D-Day. The Challenger wasn't ready. The Cromwell couldn't mount the 17-pounder. The Firefly was ready. It was good enough. And in warfare, good enough now is infinitely better than perfect later. This lesson applies in technology, business, product development, any field where timing matters. Waiting for the ideal solution often means missing the critical moment when any solution is desperately needed. The human story. At the heart of the Firefly story are people. George Brighty, who saw a problem and wouldn't let it go. George Witheridge, who'd been burned out of a tank at Gazala and understood what crews needed to survive. W.G.K. Kilbourne, who spent one night solving a problem everyone else said was impossible. Claude Gibb, who had the authority and vision to make it official. Major General Briggs, who supported the project when it mattered. And the crews. Men like Joe Ekins, who destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes. Trooper Chapman, who lined up Panthers like ducks in a row and knocked out 5 with 6 shots. Ken Tout, who wrote about the blinding flash and cramped turret but praised the gun that could kill anything. Thousands of tankers who went into combat knowing they had a fighting chance because 2 officers refused to accept impossible as an answer. Modern relevance. The Firefly story resonates today because the fundamental challenges haven't changed. Organizations still resist innovation. Bureaucracies still kill good ideas. Engineers still face problems they're told can't be solved. And people on the front lines, whether literal battlefields or competitive marketplaces, still desperately need solutions that institutions say aren't feasible. The lesson isn't that you should ignore authority or bypass official channels recklessly. Brighty and Witheridge didn't go rogue, they worked within the system, found champions, made it official. But they refused to accept no when they knew the need was real and the solution was possible. That combination of persistence, political skill, and engineering excellence is what changes the world. The Firefly also reminds us that sometimes the best solution isn't a clean sheet design. It's a modification, an adaptation, a creative combination of existing elements. The most innovative answer isn't always the newest one. Sometimes it's taking what works, the Sherman's reliability, identifying what's needed, the 17-pounder's firepower, and finding a way to combine them that everyone else missed. The final word. Between 1944 and 1945, over 2,000 Sherman Fireflies rolled off British production lines. Each one carried a gun that the Tank Decision Board said couldn't fit. Each one proved that institutional wisdom is sometimes institutionally wrong. Each one represented a victory not just over German armor but over the bureaucracy that almost prevented them from existing. The Firefly fought from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin. It destroyed Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs. It saved countless Allied lives. It terrified German crews who'd grown accustomed to invulnerability. And it did all this because 2 officers looked at a problem everyone else said was unsolvable and decided to solve it anyway. That's the real story of the Sherman Firefly. Not just a tank with a big gun. Not just a clever engineering solution. But a testament to what happens when determination meets expertise, when persistence overcomes resistance, and when people refuse to accept that the impossible is impossible. The next time someone tells you it can't be done, whether it's mounting a gun in a turret, launching a business, solving a technical problem, or achieving something that seems beyond reach, remember Major George Brighty staring at a Sherman tank and a 17-pounder gun that didn't belong together. Remember W.G.K. Kilbourne spending one night finding solutions everyone else had missed. Remember thousands of Allied tank crews who went into combat with a weapon that shouldn't have existed. And remember that sometimes, the best way to respond to impossible is to prove everyone wrong.